the continuation for any length of time of capitalism as a grow or die system dedicated to unlimited capital accumulation is a flat impossibility. Capitalism is a system that's geared to grow or die. It has to expand. I'll try to explain why. But that's in the DNA of the system, and you can't alter that. That means that if we're serious about the problem of the planet, of the environment in the Anthropocene is a useful concept because it tells us, look, human beings are now the main geological drivers of the biogeochemical processes of the entire planet. And we can't, it's impossible to continue with the system that we have. Herman Daly, who's a kind of a friend, doesn't agree. He ends his books with God rather than addressing capitalism, like his famous book, Beyond Growth. He has all of the right analysis, in my view, or a lot of it, until he gets to the end, and he doesn't know what to do, and then God comes into the picture and solves everything. But so I have some disagreements with that. I think that we have to do it, right? And we have to face up to our social system. But that's very hard for even an ecological economist to talk about. Now, I was even talking about capitalism. I was thinking of this talk as called sort of Capitalism and the Planet. It's difficult nowadays. For one reason is that I have this book by John Kenneth Galbraith, The Economics of Innocent Fraud. It was his last book. It's really an essay, and he in 2004 he wrote this book, and he said that he has a chapter called Renaming the System, and he says what they did in the 1980s is they renamed the system. They renamed it from capitalism to the free market, and he talks about that. And he says free market, or the market system, one or the other, free market or market system. And he says that the notion of the market system or the market or the free market is meaningless. You can't actually understand the system in those terms. And actually in the social sciences, they don't, right? Even in mainstream and orthodox economics, you have to have a concept of capitalism. But for the general public, it's good enough to have this notion of the free market, because it sounds good. It's got the word free in there, and we all like markets, right? You think of a little corner market, but this notion of this market that kind of runs everything by some sort of magical. We've swallowed this notion that there's some sort of a process. I mean, to some extent, that concept of market is meaningful, but as a description of the system, it isn't. And to say that that explains everything that's happening with respect to the economy, it's misleading. So, you know, in social science, they still hold on to the concept of capitalism as of course, in business, they hold on to the concept of capitalism. And that's been around for hundreds of years, and it basically accounts for the kind of system we live in. There's some different definitions of capitalism, and of course there's some that are meant to give you an idea that it's just a free market anyway. And you'll get these little models that say, oh, this is a system that's designed to just, it's a simple, they give you a simple image of a system that provides for people's needs. People need certain things, the market responds, producers, which are now the corporations instead of the real people doing the producing, provide the goods, and everything is fine, and it just goes around in a circular flow, and the people who do this service get profits and so on, and you get this very simple notion, but it's not adequate, and what is capitalism? And I want to start off with a brief definition of capitalism, and later on I'll even make things a little bit more complicated. But capitalism, in its it seems to us like the air we breathe. Sometimes we don't actually think about it. In fact, a lot of my students, they think that our system is democracy. They think that we live in a society that's run by democracy. But to the extent that we can vote or make political decisions in this society through our government, it only has a very small, a very limited realm in which it can operate. It's circumscribed by economic interests. It can only intrude in property in various ways. And even in the process of voting and electing, there are various ways, as you know, many different ways in which economics enters in to determine results, and so much so that it's more accurately, we can talk about a plutocracy more than a democracy in the society. But the capitalism relates particularly to the logic of the economy, and we can say in the briefest possible terms, capitalism is an economic and social system in which the owners of capital, that's why we call it capitalism, is because you have capitalists, but the owners of capital or capitalists appropriate the surplus product generated by the direct producers or the workers, leading to the accumulation of capital, investment, and the amassing of wealth by the owners. Production takes the material form of production of commodities for a market with the aim of generating profit and promoting accumulation. Individuals in this system pursue their self-interest, checked only by their mutual competition and the impersonal forces of the market. We could add to this by saying that competition is the enforcer of the economic laws of this system, the economic laws of motion of the system, but the driving force of the system is the accumulation of capital. And that means that the system is geared to constant expansion, and not just economic growth in some sort of very general sense, but a particular kind of economic growth is associated with increased inequality. It's based on the precariousness of the workers at the bottom, who are always threatened with unemployment and underemployment. It's a system where the surplus product generated by the society is appropriated by the owners as if they had created it all. So you have a situation now, as many of you know, where 62 individuals in the world have, all billionaires of course, have a wealth that's equal to half the world's population, 3.5 billion people. And in a few years it's going to be 50 people own as much wealth as half the world's population. My statistics are a little bit out of date, but I do know that the last time I looked, 400 people in the United States had as much wealth as the bottom half of the U.S. population. It's half the U.S. population, 150 million people. But I think it's much more concentrated than that now. What?
62.
162.
62 is what I heard.
No, that's for the world. You're talking the 62 people in the world have half the world's wealth, but in the United States, the latest figures I have, 400 people in the United States have half the U.S. wealth. And the inequality is going up very rapidly, and this is in the nature of the system. So and this is a system in which it's a kind of a juggernaut. We talk about it as though it's a little circular flow, but it actually spirals upwards, right? And in terms of its economic value, you know, the system is always expanding, the accumulation of capital. We're told in the textbooks, we're given this false little picture where we have an economy where you have to use a little simple formula from Karl Marx, he said that there's the notion that we live in a simple commodity economy where we start with a commodity with a use value, and then you use money, you exchange money for that, and then purchase another use value, one that you really want, right? And then you consume that use value, and the process is over. But actually, we have an economy where the money capitalists, the people with money to invest, buy labor power and means of production, and then they sell what is produced for more money at the end. And that more money means that they appropriate a surplus product. You can see it as MCM prime. But in the next year or the next stage, they start with M prime, and then they end up at the end with M double prime. And in the third year, they start with M double prime, and they end up with M triple prime. And the idea is it snowballs, it accumulates. That's how the system works. And it has no stopping point. It's all geared to expansion, and particularly a very unequal kind of an expansion. It's rooted in inequality, and it wouldn't work otherwise. So this is, and if you look at it in a resource sense, they'll say, oh, well, the economy is just, again, the circular flow. But if you look at what the system does, is it's extracting resources. We say from the tap end, from the environment, and then those resources pass through the system, and they end up as waste on the other end. In some ways, this is part of the human condition. It's part of our own biology as well. But capitalism does this, expands the throughput in extreme ways, and breaks through any kind of sustainability. There's no sustainability to the system. Let me give you an example, and and say in economics, if you have the notion is in this system that the world economy should be growing at a 3% annual rate. Anything below 2.5%, or if you get to about 2.5% for annual growth of the world economy, that means a global recession. The world economy is supposed to be growing at a 3% average annual rate. But if you have a 3% rate of growth, then in a century, the economy will grow to 16 times its present size. And in 2 centuries, it will grow to 250 times its present size. And in 3 centuries, it will grow to 4,000 times its present size. Now, they say, well, we can dematerialize, we can disconnect the economic expansion from the use of material resources. We can dematerialize. They can produce wealth without extracting resources and so on. But so far, all that has been shown to be false. It just hasn't happened. The system expands by also, it expands, it accumulates capital, it expands by also using more throughput, more resources, taking more resources out of the environment and dumping more waste back in. So, and if you look at this this economy, we get, it's very difficult for people in this society to deal with it, because after the Second World War, they came up with the notion of growth. Before that, economics wasn't such a public issue. It was at that time that they developed the notion of development. Before that, they didn't talk about the economy in terms of growth. And growth ended up being this concept that you hear all the time. You can't pick up a newspaper in this country without finding the words economic growth. If you can't find it anywhere else, you'll find it on the business page. there's always a business page in the newspaper, never a labor page, right? So never an environmental page. And so what does growth mean? Well, suppose you took a tree, suppose you were a conservationist and you went, or a part of a conservationist group, you went into a public forest and you planted a tree. And that tree was then growing, right? For me, that's growth, right? And growth is part of our own biology. When you're young, you're really concerned with it. Am I going to grow or not, right? But if you plant a tree in the public forest, in economic terms, that tree only contributes to growth when you cut it down. It's really important to understand this, that this notion of growth dominates us so much. If you have, let's say, if you're a parent or parents and you're raising your kid, really well, and the child is growing, you can, that's maybe growth. But if suppose you suddenly get addicted on drugs, and then the social services, they come in and they take your child away and put them in foster care. What you are doing doesn't contribute to economic growth, but the moment your child is in foster care, which is the paid system, then that increases the growth of the economy, right? If in Thailand, they're always seizing children and turning them into prostitutes, child prostitution. When they're just growing up as children, they don't contribute to economic growth, but if they seize them and they become child prostitutes, then they're contributing to economic growth. And we measure it that way. When the Exxon Valdez, had its terrible accident and spilled all that oil, that contributed much more to economic growth than it would have if they just sold the oil, because then there were all these legal costs and cleanup costs and so on. It went on for years and years, and it contributed an enormous amount to economic growth that it wouldn't be. The thing is that we never subtract anything from GDP. We only add. And anything is considered to contribute to growth if it passes through the market and generates money and generates profit. And this is the kind of system we have. And capital accumulation is built around this. And what we have in today, in a kind of a more distorted form of capitalism, monopoly capital, or even monopoly finance capital, where it's all waste is more prevalent and financialization of financial bubbles and so on. Most of it, what we produce probably in the society is a form of waste from the standpoint of any rational society, and certainly from the standpoint of the environment. So we spend, in these countries, last time they came out with semi-official figures, we spend $1 trillion a year on marketing in the United States annually, which means we spend $1 trillion convincing people to buy things that they don't want to buy, and all that marketing contributed directly to the destruction of the environment, as well as pushing people into maxing out their credit cards to buy things that are destructive of the environment. And this is the system. The system works this way. And if it doesn't grow, then we have economic crisis. We have massive unemployment. And they say, well, our first priority has to be growth. We can't concern ourselves with the environment, even if we're endangering the entire planet at this point, because the object is to expand. Yeah.
I've read that there's $700 trillion in the derivatives market, even though the gross world product is only 70. And David Corton calls that phantom growth.
Yeah,
so phantom wealth. So is that where we're getting a lot of our growth?
No, that's. I'm not sure he understands what he's talking about, but those are nominal amounts, right? So nobody knows what it's valued as. This has to do with the whole realm of speculation. If they tried to turn that in, it wouldn't be 700, you know, whatever.
Yeah,
it's that nobody actually knows what that's worth. So the numbers are basically meaningless, right? But certainly there are the main means of gaining wealth now has shifted to the financial system, which has become a way of neoliberalism. As part of that has been a way of accumulating and wealth, at least, if not actually expanding the economy in a more rapid rate, and we're very dependent on this. I could explain to you how the finance works and so on, but I don't have time. But I wanted you to understand these sort of basic things. Actually, the concept of capital, in Marx's terms, is self-expanding value. It's a social relation, and it's a social relation of self-expanding value. And we have to. And one of the things is in mainstream in economics. At one point, we talked about social and environmental costs of the system. They changed that to the term externalities, which to kind of downplay that these the way in which these are social environmental costs. The system itself doesn't internalize very many of the costs to society and the environment of its operations. So if the automobile industry had to pay all of the social environmental costs that it generated, and that was internalized in the price, nobody would be able to buy an automobile. It would be too expensive. But they basically pass these costs on to society in all sorts of ways. Air pollution, cancer, destruction, you can name it. And those costs are not part of the accounting of the system. They don't actually enter into the market. And so even though child prostitution would add to GDP, the destruction of a river or air pollution or whatever you want to look at, it doesn't subtract anything. It's outside of the metrics, and so the system can grow, and it can grow. It can keep on growing while it's actually degrading the entire planet. The system, the capitalist system, would be the last. It does not respond to the destruction of the environment directly. Capitalists would be the last to know. Insofar as you're accumulating wealth, you can accumulate wealth faster by destroying the environment. For example, if you put lead in the water of a whole city, maybe not entirely intentionally, but you find out, well, this is a good thing because everybody has to buy bottled water now. And that then enters the market and accumulation of capital. So this is the kind of system we're living in.
You said that a tree doesn't start adding into the GDP until it's cut down. But throughout its entire life, a tree is performing photosynthesis, which is providing air for all of us to breathe. If we don't have air to breathe, we can't do any of the market things that you're talking about.
You sound like an environmentalist. That's not the way a capitalist would talk. So
sell it that way.
They wouldn't understand what you were saying. Right? Well,
that's what changing the rules trying to monetize.
So I want to add something else here, because maybe this sounds hopeless, because what we're sort of given the idea, and I'm kind of trying to give you some principles for action here. We get the idea that capitalism is everything, and certainly it kind of intrudes into everything in our environment and our society and so on. But it isn't actually everything. It actually is a particular kind of logic. It's a certain form of social, we could call social metabolic reproduction. Marx talked about social metabolism as the relationship between human beings and nature. And he said that metabolism had to be maintained, and he said that we had to sustain the planet for future generations. He actually said that. He didn't use the word sustain. He said that we had to protect the planet for future generations. We had to deal with ecological crises and restore the environment. And the thing is that it's a certain kind of logic. So if you capital accumulation takes you in a certain direction. You can see at every point where profits lead, where accumulation leads, where the logic of the market leads. And you can either go with that or you can go against that. If you go against that logic, then you're fighting the system. And if enough of us go against that logic and we say we want people on the planet before profits, and we push for another logic, then we're basically pushing capitalist society out of the way. We have to reconstruct our social life in terms of sustainability, in terms of on an egalitarian basis. I always say that it all comes down to ecological sustainability and substantive equality. Those two things are what we have to fight for, and we can do it. Larry Summers says the logic of the market tells us we need to send toxic waste to third world countries, and he's right. Or he's saying the logic of capitalism, and we have to say, well, then we don't want capitalism. We don't want to produce the toxic waste, so we want to institute a totally different logic. In other words, we have room to fight because it's a process we're fighting against. It's not the system is dependent on the process, and if we fight that process, we fight that logic, then we are in the very process creating another world, and I see it in the environmental struggles every day. But if you're going to do that, you're going to run into lots of enemies. There's vested interests. The state, which is under the control of vested interests. So you have to sort of think of yourself as revolutionaries in some sense. If there's, people don't like the word revolution, but if we're struggling to basically save the Earth system and create a sustainable society, and we have to go against the logic of this juggernaut, it more deserves the term revolution than anything that's come before. And that's exactly what we have to do. We basically have to push in the other direction, and then we have to create our own alternatives, our own sustainable, egalitarian society. And so I'll leave it to Jamil at this point.
Well, since we wanted to have a little bit of time for discussion, I'm actually not going to talk for very long at all, but I would like to just elaborate on one of the points that John made, or one of the sort of aspects of capitalism, maybe introduce a few terms to you. And you discussed the cycle of production, how it goes from starting with money to a commodity to more money at the end of the process, and that competition sort of enforces that dictum on every single capitalist on pain of extinction. So if we take that for granted, it's obvious that there's a continuous pressure placed on business to reduce costs, every cycle, every business cycle, every week, every day. If we assume that labor is the primary source, or the sort of where all the value comes from, that you basically have to exploit workers in some way or another to get some profit, it's obvious that labor productivity, or increasing the efficiency or productivity of labor, is going to be crucial. So there are a variety of ways of doing this. You can quicken the pace of work, increase the length of the working day, favor more precarious parts of the workforce, like women, migrants, undocumented workers, etc. But the important thing to notice about this process is how it's regulated, especially with respect to machinery, because there's a lot of, I think, assumptions, especially right now, that sort of automation is just this juggernaut. It's like incessantly what's happening is that robots are replacing workers, and that is really what we need to blame for higher inequality and increasing unemployment. But I just want to point out that if wages are pitifully low, if they're so low that owners can't profitably replace workers with machinery, they're very unlikely to do so. And there's a lot of examples of this. You can look to Bangladesh, for example. You can look at a lot of where major industrial accidents have occurred because there's usually huge swaths of very poor people working in very, very questionable conditions or horrible conditions, and there tends to be major industrial accidents. You could look to Foxconn. You could look again to Bangladesh, the clothing industry. But as the price of labor power increases, say, for example, if the economy starts to grow very quickly, you can look to China as an example, wages tend to go up, and the number of unemployed tends to decline. But what regulates this whole process, capitalism actually has an internal sort of regulating mechanism for wages. This is something that Marx discovered, probably, I would say, one of his key discoveries, which is something he called the relative surplus population, or a vast pool of essentially redundant people, redundant labor. So these are people who are unemployed, in the technical sense or the economic sense, underemployed, or just outside of the workforce, like what we call now long-term unemployed, who decide that there's just no viable jobs available or decent jobs available, so they just drop out completely. This is called the reserve army of labor. And just to give you a sense, if you were to quantify this, it's actually possible to quantify with ILO statistics. Sorry, this got messed up when I was changing it, but this is an ILO, International Labor Organization term for vulnerable workers. They could be understood as essentially people who are working within like a family in sort of peasant conditions, panhandling on the street. They have no connection to the sort of wage workforce, which would be this layer here. This small proprietors, by the way, is just a tiny, tiny part of it. Wage workers are people who have a regular employment and they're working for some kind of firm or something. Vulnerable. Again, the vast majority of people across the world are in this layer. Then you have unemployed. Then you have people of working age that are inactive. So you can see that on average, and it's decreasing because in capitalism slowly is integrating more and more people into wage labor. Like, for example, in China, as the wages have gone up because it's been growing so quickly and they've needed more and more industrial workers, what they're starting to do is develop policies to get more peasants out from the country to come into urban areas to work so that they can increase the reserve, again, the amount of unemployed or people just sort of on the margins of employment, because that serves as a check on other workers to keep wages in an acceptable level for business. Now, I think the reserve army is really interesting because it illustrates sort of an important lesson with respect to certain environmental issues like population growth. Many environmentalists would argue that achieving zero population growth is critical to addressing a whole bunch of different environmental problems. But even if you account for the vastly different ecological footprint of people, say, in developed countries, just a little aside, the 3 billion poorest people on the planet emit essentially nothing. So the development, in other words, the development of the desperately poor is not in conflict with solving the climate problem, which is a problem of the very rich. But even if you accounted for that, very few people, very few environmentalists would account for how zero population growth would affect the economy. Because as I've kind of illustrated with the reserve army of labor, if you had zero population growth, it would actually affect the reserve army of labor. It could have the effect of increasing wages, decreasing profit margins. It would also decrease population growth would reduce demand for everything from new housing to basic commodities, et cetera. It would literally cause a crisis of growth, right? So if you're trying to argue for something like that, and you have people that are already on the margins of employment, their wages are stagnating, they don't see much decent employment around, and then you go around talking about degrowth, for example, you can see that a lot of people are not going to take that message lightly. So this is kind of an illustration of, if you understand how the system works, you understand it's a way to maybe to explain to people like that while we're arguing for less population growth, we also maybe want to think about policies or ways of addressing the inequalities and high unemployment, underemployment, et cetera, at the same time, because this is something that's generated by the system. And we understand that degrowth, for example, or reducing the amount of growth or reducing population size has to be understood within the context of our system. Either we have to change something about the system, or we have to accept that it's not really possible unless you want to essentially affect the livelihoods of millions of people in the process of pushing, like a policy aim, like our policy goal like that. So we didn't talk that much about economic crisis and unemployment. So I'm just going to put a couple slides up, and then I'm just going to move to discussion, just to kind of illustrate some aspects of the system, or some realities of the need for growth that John was pointing out about. So this is a lot more complicated. It looks a lot more complicated than it actually is. So if you look at the last, essentially 61 years of the U.S. economy, and you broke it down by, these are the years that had less than 1%, 1.1% growth. These are the years that had between 1.2 and 3%, 3.1 to 5, et cetera, greater than 5%. What happens to the change in unemployment under, if you averaged all of those years? And you can see that, so a positive number here indicates that the unemployment rate goes up. So the only year, the growth rate that you need, what this is saying is that the growth rate that you actually require, even just to decrease the unemployment rate by 0.2%, is between 3.1 and 5.1% growth in GDP. And if you know how the economy is growing right now, you'll kind of see that this presents a major problem. Really, what you need is closer to 5% growth. Now, of course, you hear all the time about the unemployment rate decreasing right now, for example, but usually nowadays you get the caveat about people dropping out of the labor force, which is really important to understand, because the way that we measure unemployment is highly confusing. If you are not considered part of the labor force, and the only way you can be part of the labor force is either be working, or you have to be unemployed and have looked for a job in the last 4 weeks. So if the BLS comes and interviews you and you say, well, I haven't looked in the last 4 weeks, I know there's nothing available, then you're not part of the labor force. Therefore, you're not even part of the whole calculation for unemployment. If you include those people in the rate of unemployment, it gets significantly higher. So don't be fooled by what you're hearing about the economy. Where our growth is definitely sputtering, to say the least.
Are you taking questions or not, Jamil?
No, not just yet. I'm almost done. Again, I didn't go specifically into the scientific management of the labor process and sort of what monopoly. John touched for a second on the growth of monopoly, and essentially what we mean by that are, just with brevity, it's the growth of major corporations. It's kind of the growth of oligopoly. I don't think anyone would disagree with the assertion that in almost every single major U.S. industry, there's about a handful of firms that essentially control or have produce most of the output and control everything from prices to hiring practices to various other aspects of economic production. The key thing to understand or to account for, I think, in terms of trying to think about how an understanding of capitalism can contribute to, say, more effective organizing, it's important to realize that there's basically been an onslaught against workers ever since they had some modest gains after the Great Depression. Everybody knows that the unionization rate has decreased. Actually, recently stopped decreasing in the last few years. But organized labor and even just any kind of groups of workers able to resist capital at the point of production, that power has decreased significantly, and with it, I would argue, a significant amount of democratic potential has been lost. Because remember, this is a strike, for example, is one of the few nonviolent ways we have as citizens to just stop the whole entire system. It literally makes shit stop, and it's majorly expensive and costly for the system to do that. And workers are workers as a group. Unions, people tend to look down on them, I guess, nowadays. But they are obviously arguing and trying to negotiate conditions of their own labor and their wages, etc. But they're also a democratic force. Again, when you have that power to stop production, if we had all of Monsanto on our side, all the workers of Monsanto on our side, and said, look, we want this company to stop this. What can we do to support you? Can you have some effect inside the system? Well, if they had some power within that huge behemoth, maybe they could help, or maybe they could offer some help to change the policies and practices. But across the whole entire planet, and within these giant firms, the sort of name of the game has been reducing the skill level, taking knowledge away from workers and concentrating it in management, making people more replaceable generally, and all of those things contribute to the ability to break strikes, essentially to weaken organized labor. But it's not just a fight for workers. You have to think about this group of people. our identities as workers as contributing to the sort of continual functioning of the system as a point where we can press our issues, as a point of organization. So again, I'm just kind of touching on another aspect of the relationship between capitalism and the environment, specifically with regard to organizing. So, I mean, I have more that I could go over just to illustrate the, what I was going to go into is like what are the weaknesses of the system now? How does a monopoly capitalist system go into crisis, or what are the main contributors to sort of the dysfunction of the system of late, like since 2008 financial crisis? But I think we can, and like the financial, some of the questions about finance, but maybe I can address those things as we take some questions. So yeah, I'll just stop there.
Do you want to say something about the paradox of growth with respect to the environment?
Well, yeah. I guess we just, I wanted to have some chance for discussion, and this panel stopped at 3:20? Oh, 3:30. So we have 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think that's good enough time for some questions. And I think I can get to some of these other things that I wanted to discuss at the same time. So
let me just add something to what Jamil was saying. The paradox is that under this system, I mean, as long as you're operating in these rules, right, that are established by the capitalist system, if you have economic growth or capital accumulation, it degrades the environment. It tends to threaten the environment, particularly at the point that we're in history now. If you don't have economic growth, you have economic crisis and people are thrown out of work. So there's a kind of catch-22 as long as we're in the system. Progressives argue for growth because they want jobs, because that's the only way in which the system provides jobs. And yet that goes against the environment. So we have to recognize this is a paradox of the system, and the only way to deal with that is to go against the logic of the system itself.
Yeah, John is actually, I'm sorry, I understand what you meant now. What he's referring to is often called, or sometimes called, the treadmill of accumulation. So that we're all on the treadmill. I mean, everybody's livelihood is connected to the basic, the healthy functioning of the system, the avoidance of some kind of crisis, like we all experienced, one of the worst since the Great Depression in 2007, 2008. So, your solutions, unfortunately, to the extent that they remain within the system, they're very restricted, right? And I think that's important to understand. But we can still propose policies and changes and, just plans that at least take that into account. Go ahead.
So you're talking about the challenges of solutions within the system. And I agree, you've got the capitalist system that requires growth in order to continue itself. And then you've got the regulations within the capitalist system, like the New Deal that put limits on it, but still there was more equality, but there was still the growth economy, which is problematic for the environment. What about complementary systems? So you balance a capitalist system with a complementary currency, so financial and monetary reform. Cuba is a great example of that because they're a limited island, and when they had economic issues, they developed the CUC, which is a local currency. And I understand the Cubans don't like it because they can't buy all the things that are on the international market. But with that system of currency, which values human labor, everybody's fed, everybody's housed, and everybody has health care. And you can create the currency to value the labor that people do. Bernard Lietaer in his book Rethinking Money goes into many examples around the world of where these complementary currency systems at the level of local government are incredibly powerful tools at matching unmet needs for work and for restorative work with underutilized resources, which is all of these workers. So we could potentially pay people to do restoration work with a different kind of a currency system. So I'm curious if you're familiar with these policies, if you want to say a word or two about them.
Unfortunately, I'm not. I mean, it sounds like a good idea. Do you want to say something about it?
It's one strategy. Of course, you still have to deal with the system, you know, it's encouraging another system of distribution.
One thing I will say about that is that, I mean, I wouldn't refer to Cuba as necessarily having achieved its socialist ends, but it calls itself socialist. And one thing I can say for sure is that that currency system, if it was developed in Cuba and is working in Cuba, one thing about it is that it's structurally really somewhat different than the United States. So, I mean, I guess you'd have to adapt something like that. You know, you have a completely different kind of democratic structure. You know, Cuba's economy was very isolated. It's nowhere near as complex as the United States. I mean, there's lots of things you'd have to consider, but that's what helps. That's why it helps understand capitalism. So I'm gonna.
They had to have a revolution first.
Yeah.
And people starve.
So we're gonna go 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
When you were talking about potential crises of capitalism, is it possible to look at, say, ISIS or some of the movements there as anti-capitalist forces?
I think absolutely. I mean, I don't know if anybody, I don't know about ISIS in particular, but anybody that's familiarized themselves with like Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden had a very detailed economic critique of the United States and their involvement in the Middle East, right? I mean, his argument was that that oil should be used for social ends, and it should be primarily, it's a lot of what some socialist countries have done, or they've tried to nationalize their key resources so that they're not just raped and pillaged. And certainly initially, I think that the ideology has changed dramatically under ISIS. But, yeah.
I would say they're anti-imperialist movements, which that doesn't mean they're always progressive, right? But they're responses to imperialism and the destruction of their way of life, right? I mean, ISIS wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the fact that the United States decided to carry out regime change in Iraq.
Talking about the system that we have here domestically, I wonder if you could comment about some of the movements through the New Economy Coalition, the Democracy Collaborative, and efforts to build worker cooperatives and really to change the economic system to the extent that we can.
That's another strategy. Gabriel Pearl, who writes for Monthly Review sometimes, is one of the proponents of that, and I think it's a good strategy. I mean, I tend to think at this point, we've got to try a lot of different things, and a lot of different struggles, and see if they coalesce and organize on a multiple bases. I think that's a very good way to organize, and it could achieve a lot. But it's going on outside of the environmental movement. That movement is not linked to environmental struggles. We need more linkages.
Since we're talking about the economy, and one of the things that I've noticed, and I've been following a lot of statistics, is that we're going towards an older generation. There's always the talk about the Gen Xers and the baby boomers growing up and whatnot. I'm curious as to what, and you mentioned about robotics being taking over jobs. I'm curious where in the mix that will either hinder us or help us economically, because I foresee that in the future, I mean, we're going to have less younger workers, so we're going to have more of a situation where there's old people working later in their years, and I'm looking at a system where we can't keep supporting people on food stamps and all these things, because it's not going to, our economy is, as you said, we were showing the growth rate figures, we'd have to have 5% growth rate in order to have full unemployment.
Get closer to full unemployment. There'll never be full unemployment.
Yeah. So where does a socialistic system come into that, where everybody's needs are provided and it still supports somewhat capitalism? That's my question.
Well, I'm just going to give a brief answer.
She mentioned about Cuba and what they're doing. I'm curious, how can we move towards a more positive thing where obviously the environment I'm concerned about, but we're always looking at pitting jobs against the environment or this or that.
Well,
and it's like, where's the compromise, or where can we all win in this situation?
I don't think. Well, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think most socialists would argue that automation is not necessarily a bad thing. If the people that own the machines are only capitalists, and all the profits from that automation or from the usage of those machines goes only to capital, which is what's been happening. That's been widening the income inequality for the last 4 decades. Then that's not good. But there's no reason why efficient, sustainable automation cannot be used. I think most socialists would argue that that's excellent. But I would also argue that the system is actually holding back technology. It seems like an odd thing to say, but this is something that Marx argued, that sort of one of the contradictions that developed as a mode of production. He called capitalism a mode of production. It's ephemeral. It's not going to exist forever, despite what people tell you. And that as the system gets towards its end, there are a lot of contradictions built up, and one of them is a contradiction between sort of our capacity, our technological or innovative capacity, and the system. Monopolists don't necessarily want the most efficient technology. They don't necessarily want to distribute the wealth. Not distribute, but to use certain technologies if it's not going to be profitable to them. Again, if I'm a capitalist producing those, yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a lot of examples, but
I'll give you an example. Cuba has a vaccine for lung cancer. They sell it for $1.50. And there's talk about getting that for the United States with the Cuban science is very advanced, but their science is oriented in a different direction. It's towards meeting the needs of the people. And so there's this idea that they can maybe get this drug into the United States, but the pharmaceutical companies don't want it, right? They go in a different direction. Right? I believe they could develop the technology that Cuba has, vaccine for lung cancer, but they don't. And you have to ask yourself why, right? This happens because our technology is driven by profits. That's what it's all about. And so that's a limit of the system. I wouldn't get too hooked up on technology. I'm really kind of focused. There's 2 issues here. One is the environment, and one is the economy, right? The economy is stagnating, and in the United States and in all the other rich countries. And the root of the stagnation is actually in inequality. And we can't go into all of that, but that's where it comes from. And we've got the greatest inequality we've ever had in history, and that's related to the stagnation of the economy, the inability to provide jobs, and the fact that all the income gains are going to the people in the top one half of 1%. In the top the top 0.5% are getting all of the income gains from growth. The bottom part of the population is actually seeing its real wages, has been seeing its real wages decline. They've been not getting the benefits of growth. Sometimes, and unemployment is more common. The fact is that the system is failing the population, and at the same time, we're wrecking the environment. So the question is, do we sort of think of how can we get at our goals within this system? Or do we think in terms of how can we struggle against the system? I think in terms of 2 stages, which we argue for and what every environmentalist needs to know about capitalism. There's certain things that we can propose to do now that are really important, say with respect to climate change, that we can reasonably argue for within the system now, and that we have to because we have very little time in which to act, right?
What are they?
Well, I mean, they're just innumerable. Like the Children's Trust case is going to occur in Eugene in a few days. What if they won? What if the government and the oil companies are on the other side? But what if we actually decided to make the atmosphere, to make the environment a public trust and protected, and that's going against the logic of the system. The oil companies say they're saying that this would lower their profits. That would that would, and I say,
Fuck 'em.
yes.
Thank you.
So we have to change the rules, right? And we have to, and then in the long term, we can talk about reshaping society in more fundamental ways.
So we're going to take 2 more questions and have to call it. So it's here and here, I think.
Yeah, it's actually, in some ways you answered what I was going to be bringing up. I wanted to bring up for you guys to answer generally globalization and that type of market where we're exploiting countries and allowing exploitation to happen in certain places. When we talk about this thing that's happening in Oregon, when we're talking about the trust possibly occurring here for the environment, when you look at globalization, you look at what lawyers can do in terms of when you have a lot of people in the free market thinking, even people pushing the TPP and all these trade deals, what we've seen is that the exploitation of resources is just becoming more and more of a global phenomenon, instead of looking at models where we're focusing on local economies that are actually not singular economies, not producing one item, but they're producing a multitude of things and becoming whole in such a way that it's almost counter, obviously it's counter to the current economic system, but it almost makes like, do we have to have that much money if we're starting to look at, if we have the ability and the know-how and the science to make things happen from the earth, working with the earth in local economies, can't we start to regulate this idea that the free market globalization is the right move to do and say, no, let's make lawyers work towards limiting that potential because it's so destructive to the environment?
The global versus local production is a major issue. We should have more local production. If you have a plastic spoon made in China, you eat something with it for a few seconds, throw it in the garbage, right? And then they have to send another one from China, right? Using, what's the logic of this? And if you know about the Paris Agreement, they promoted that in the media as a 100% success. But there's all sorts of problems with the Paris Climate Agreement. But probably the most interesting one, because it shows how things really work, is that they eliminated from the climate measures and the climate regulations. Of course, there's no sanctions, and the whole thing is somewhat of a fraud. But they eliminated from the whole agreement the shipping, air and sea shipping of goods. Why did they do that? It's because they're trying to pass all of these international free trade agreements, and that's the priority in terms of expanding the global economy. So they excluded that, and that sector, those emissions from air and sea shipping are equal to the total emissions of Germany and Britain combined. And they're growing at a 7% annual rate, which is faster than the growth of China at this point. So that's like the one, and they left that out because the economy, the global economy, in the agreement, the expansion of the global economy is more important than the preservation of the planet.
Yeah.
My question is sort of answered, so go ahead.
I'll just move one last one here.
I just had a question of information. You referred to Marx's concept of the relationship between nature and environment and labor was the metabolic...
Social metabolism.
Where do you find that in his writings?
In Capital, in the chapter on modern industry, the final part on agriculture, and in that's in volume 1 of Capital. In volume 3, it's in the, I don't remember the page number. It's at the very end, the last few pages of the section on ground rent. Of that whole part.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to read further about that, this is John's book, Marx's Ecology, which has been translated into about 10 different languages, and he's actually coming out with the second volume of this next year or so, right?
Marx was introduced this notion of social metabolism, which all ecosystem analysis ended up being based on the concept of metabolism. It's what direction that science went. he introduced this as a way of understanding the relationship between society and nature, and the fact that and social metabolism was actually the labor process, or the labor and production process. So how we metabolize with nature socially depends on the nature of our production, how we produce. And he integrated the social critique of capitalism with ecological critique in that way. It's been fundamentally important. For the whole eco-socialist movement around the world is now based on this idea.
Well, the comment that Jamil said that the people in the world that are underdeveloped contribute zero to the pollution.
The bottom 3 billion. Yeah.
I mean, they all eat. I mean, if they eat at all, they eat. They urinate wherever they urinate. They shit. Whatever they breathe.
I didn't say they contributed nothing. I said they contributed zero emissions.
Zero emissions.
They're not responsible for the carbon emissions.
They breathe, of course they do.